Hello, welcome back to Jules's Archive. I'm back with a reading recap for February. As you can see by this fat stack, I read quite a bit in February. I don't know what got into me this month, but I was really plowing through books. I was having a great time, and even the books that I didn't love didn't really put me in at all of a slump. I was just very excited to pick up the next book, which is very fun because that's not always the case. The first book I read this month was The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This was for my book club, so I didn't necessarily pick this, but it was for the month. I had wanted to read Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro for years now. The premise of that book sounds really interesting to me, kind of being, like, I haven't read it, but I think it follows kind of like someone who befriends AI or something, but it was written a couple years ago. And I'd heard it was like gorgeously written, lyrical, and had a lot to say about kind of modern society and technology. And so when this book was chosen for my book club, I was curious because I wanted to read something by Ishiguro. That it follows an English butler kind of in post-World War II England. After decades of serving in the most prominent homes in England, he's kind of transitioning to the point where the property is owned by an American, and the book follows a few-day road trip that he takes, kind of exploring England for the first time and being separated from his job for the first time in really his whole life. It follows his drive through the country, a few people that he meets, and the sights that he sees. But this book is really not about that. It's written kind of as a stream of consciousness, as if Stevens, the butler, was writing in a journal or dictating kind of what his road trip was like, and it very much switches between the present on his road trip and past vignettes of his time serving in the home Darlington Hall. So it's definitely literary fiction. It's a bit meandering. It's somewhat linear in terms of the history that he goes through, and we get to learn a little bit more about what England looked like in terms of, aristocrats and noble people, but also a little bit on like the working class in terms of the people who served the rich. I really wanted to love this. I love books where you kind of see a different side of history, and I really thought I was going to get that from the butler perspective, but it just was so boring. The stream of consciousness format was so meandering. He just kind of made the same points over and over. Stevens talks a lot about kind of dignity in his role and what that means to him and what he saw in his performance and other people that he worked with through their work. But it really doesn't say much to me, and I wasn't left with really anything to think about. I heard a lot about like the subtlety of this book and the quiet devastation, so I kept expecting as I was reading to kind of get to some part where there's either a plot twist or I learned something really devastating about Stevens. And although the history is interesting and you learn a little bit more about like perspectives in England on World War II, I was just not affected. I put this down and like literally have not thought about it since, which is really disappointing. And like the moment something interesting would happen, either in like the future or the past timelines, we would go back in time or fast forward. So it was kind of a frustrating read. And when my book club had our discussion, we literally probably chatted for like a half an hour, and then we're just kind of like, yeah, so that's that. I feel like this had so much potential, and although I thought the writing was beautiful in parts, it was very uneven and just not very impactful. So I gave The Remains of the Day just 3.25. It wasn't bad. I think it was well written in terms of prose, but maybe not structure. It did give me a little bit to think about, but I really wasn't sat with much. I got this copy from Bridge Street Books in Washington, D.C., which is a really cute shop in Georgetown. I loved discovering that last time I was in the city. And the next book I read is one of my favorites. I'm obsessed with her. Is This a Cry for Help by Emily Austen. I talked about this in my 2026 highly anticipated reads video because this book just came out in January. Follows this 30-something-year-old lesbian, Darcy, who is just coming back to her work as a librarian from a leave of absence due to kind of a mental breakdown after her ex-boyfriend of several years passes, after she finds out he passes. So we start off with her going back to work, and then we kind of learn through her interactions with her coworkers, with different people in the community, why she had left work and what happened leading up to her sudden leave of absence. But also there's lots of happenings, you know, in the library, but also the surrounding community in the small town that she lives in, and her friends, etc. This book, I would say, had a quiet subtlety to it. It is super, super, super relevant to the times we're living in the United States. It talks about book bans, rising conservatism across the United States, and the threat of censorship in general in education and public spaces, etc. But it also talks a lot about like individual mental health in such a gorgeous way. Emily Austen's writing is just so funny, irreverent, unique. Her writing style is like nothing else I've ever read before. I will say the main character, Darcy, read very similarly to Glinda in the other book I read, Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead, just like a month or two ago. So I will say those books felt very similar, but because I love the subject matter so much and the message of the book, and I just grew so attached to the characters and kind of the outcomes, this is still one of my favorites. I think because this is so similar in style and kind of structure and character to the other book I read, I won't be reading another Emily Austen book for a while. I think they're really a balm for the soul, especially with kind of current events if you live in the US and if you're a queer person. But yeah, they're so similar that I think I would want to save it for a time when I feel a little bit more distance from Austen's writing. This still gets a 4.5 from me just because it's not perfect, but it's perfect to me, you know? Okay, and the next book I read is Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees by Patrick Horvath, illustrated partially by Hassan Othmane Ilhau. I don't know if I said that correctly, but it's this crazy graphic novel. It follows kind of this small town murderer, this little black bear named Samantha Strong, who is kind of like a strong pillar of the community, but also just like low-key serial killer in the big city by night. But the town is disrupted when a different killer comes in and murders a local resident. And so Samantha Strong kind of goes into like detective mode to try and find that killer. And it disrupts her cozy life and everything. This book is so insane. Like, I'll just show you one of my favorite pages. So you get into it so quickly, like showing Samantha's murder, but it's such in this like cutesy style with all these little animals and like the community. I don't know, it's so funny. And honestly, when I was attracted to this book for the art style and just like the quirky premise, but it is quite a compelling story as well. I wasn't expecting the plot twist by the end, and it's very satisfying, but tied up very quickly as well. So I read this in like an afternoon when I just wanted like a quick, satisfying read. And it also delivers on like so many details throughout the story, kind of transitioning between sections. You kind of learn about events through these newspaper pages, and it has so many details on like events we know about and kind of other related interactions, and also just like puns on stores that are named after like different animals, and these animals have pets, which is kind of crazy, and I think like, you know, could make a statement about humanity. It was just so fun. Like, I just had such a good time. I was showing all my friends, like, my favorite pages. It's, like, not that disturbing. Like, I'm not a horror fan. I do not read horror. I do not like gory stories. But this is just, like, a perfect mix of fantastical and fun and just, like, crazy. Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees gets 3.75 for me. It's a good time. I don't think it's going to be one of my favorites. I don't think it's going to stick with me forever, but I'm glad that I own it, and I'm going to give it to friends. A friend is actually currently borrowing this. And I got this from Sour Cherry Comics, which is a like comics and graphic novel store in the Mission in San Francisco, but I got it at SF Queer Comics Fest. Okay, and then switching gears to some nonfiction, I started Hood Feminism, Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot by Mickey Kendall in January, and kind of read it throughout January and February. This is essentially kind of a guide aimed at white women, or kind of like white feminist allies. It covers different topics from like gun violence, hunger, fear, reproductive justice, but kind of from the lens of like who white feminism forgets in popular movements, primarily covering like Black women. I generally am glad that I read this, but I have many qualms with it. I learned a lot on different topics, and I'm glad that I own a copy that I was able to like annotate and dog ear so I can come back if, you know, I'm chatting with someone about certain topics and kind of want to reference Kendall's points. But I do think this is set up to be a book that it is not. So the byline is notes from the women that a movement forgot, but really it's from one woman. This is kind of written sort of like a memoir, and a lot of the evidence put forward is really just like Kendall's lived experience and the lived experience of people near her. And she kind of extrapolates those experiences and makes arguments kind of for the entirety of like Black women in America, or even goes as far to kind of cover different groups, different marginalized groups like people with disabilities, other people of color in the US, trans people. But I often feel like the points that she's making, yes, probably expand to other subsets, but not as far as she's going to argue. I think there's also a lot of like repeated points just kind of repackaged, and it made it hard to really just like dig deep into topics. The chapters are pretty uneven. I think there's some chapters where I learned a lot more and, you know, they had more perspectives to offer than others. Again, in this kind of like varying evidence. Some chapters seemed more backed up than others. I found this book like pretty uneven and frustrating at times because it wasn't really giving me what I felt like was promised from the premise and from the blurb. I don't think it really addresses all the blind spots in the modern feminist movement that I think it promises to, but I do think it's worth reading really for anyone, because we've all had our own limited experiences with feminism, you know, limited viewpoints, whether or not we want to acknowledge it. We live in echo chambers in our communities and, you know, upbringing. So I do think this is worth reading by pretty much everybody, but also like you'll want to supplement it with other literature. So yeah, I gave this, you know, just 3 stars down the line, because again, worth reading, didn't blow my mind. I'm glad I own a copy to reference it, but that's kind of where it ends. And I picked this up from a little library. Okay, going forward with nonfiction, if you could call it. I read this very popular like self-help book, The 4 Agreements, A Practical Guide to Personal Freedom by Don Miguel Ruiz. It's a very short book. I have a friend who references the 4 Agreements so often and has talked with me at length about like how it's, you know, kind of helped her just kind of realize things about herself. So I read this for her. I kind of hate self-help books that are set up to be like spiritual, without really a basis in anything, but just kind of like an individual's experience. This is based loosely on like Toltec wisdom, which I think is like kind of indigenous group. And it's really short. It's pretty much an introduction, a chapter on each of the 4 agreements, which are: be impeccable with your word, don't take any personally, don't make assumptions, and always do your best. And then a summary, as well as like some prayers, which are basically kind of like affirmations in the back of the book. This is also pretty uneven, I found. After I read just the introduction, I was like, I hate this. It was coming off as so preachy. It was just like spirituality, or it was like psychology, basic psychology concepts kind of wrapped up as spirituality. And I hate when authors do that, or when anyone does that really. So I hated the first part. But then my friend said to just like push through. She also hated it, but that the chapters on the 4 agreements are better. Once I got to like the 2nd or 3rd agreement, I was finding some wisdom in it. But I think this book is better treated as one to pick up when, you know, you're naturally thinking about some of the lessons in this in your own personal life. You're struggling at work with like taking everything personally and being offended when given feedback. Like that might be a time to read this. But if you're generally like chilling or don't really have that kind of thing that you want to think about right now, this really isn't that helpful. I also think it's like borderline problematic, the way it really doesn't acknowledge psychology at all and is really like, oh, this is just, I don't know, and just packaging it as spirituality. I do know that like indigenous groups, like we're thinking like throughout history, didn't have access to psychology concepts yet. So this is genuinely like kind of things they realized through lived experience. So there's that, but I really hated the writing style and it was pretty repetitive. So sometimes it was really annoying. So I gave this 2.75 and I'm just borrowing this copy from a friend. Okay. And then next, I think everybody would recognize this. This is Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reed, which is a hockey romance, queer hockey romance between two men on like rival pro hockey teams. But then they kind of embark on like a 10-year secret situationship. I love the series like everybody else. When it came out, I think I watched it while I was home in December, and then I like pretty much immediately reserved this from the library just because I had never read the book. I had never wanted to read the book, but I love the show so much that I thought the book would have some potential. And I would say this is objectively not great. The writing is like pretty bad. It's like so surface level. It's giving YA, but it's like too smutty to be YA. Like it's absolutely for adults, but it's just not written well. I think the like details are omitted and there's not a lot of consistency. For example, like we know from the book, ginger ale is like a big thing for Shane, right? And in like 2/3 of the book, he's just drinking beer. And then at some point, it feels like Rachel Reed just decides, oh, he likes ginger ale. And that like helps him, his anxiety and stuff. And then it becomes something. But those details are not well incorporated at all. I will say, I feel like Ilya feels a lot more fleshed out than Shane as a character. I think it's fun in the book, you get to see from both of their perspectives. So there's a little bit more insight into like why they're making certain decisions, why they're saying certain things than there is in the show. But that's kind of it. There's also like a slightly different series of events. Like the same main events happen, but they happen at different points than in the show. And that doesn't have as much of like an impact and oomph as it does in the show. But I gotta acknowledge that this is the source material. The show is building off of this material, so obviously that could be better. But this is not a masterpiece. There's also like quite a few typos, inconsistencies, and just like the printing. And also like there was like fully a line that was like repeated and rewritten. I don't know what the editor was doing on this, but I don't want them editing anything I write. So I will say, objectively not great, but I read it in a day. It's so fun. I would recommend it. I gave this to a friend to read after me. And then, yeah, just got it from the library. So I wouldn't buy it, but I'm glad that I read it. And I will be reading The Long Game. I don't plan to read any of other like game changer books. I know Reed has like a whole series with other like pro hockey couples. But I don't really care. I just care about like Ilya and Shane. So yeah, objectively not very good. I gave it like 2.5 stars, but also a great time. So was it worth it? Yes. And then the last book that I read is another graphic novel, more so like a set of comics called Hidden Systems, Water, Electricity, the Internet, and the Secrets Behind the Systems We Use Every Day by Dan Knott. It basically is a set of comics that explains how different systems work. Starts with like electricity, or starts with the internet and then goes into kind of more like even farther behind the scenes systems. Like electricity incorporates history, but also like current kind of consequences and challenges with these technologies and the systems as they're set up. It's really primarily focused on the United States, especially when it comes to like electricity, but does expand globally when relevant, especially in, talking about colonialism and how that affected the modern water systems that we have, etc. I will say this is an excellent work of science communication. I took a class on science communication in college. I would have brought this to my professor. Like, it is excellent in breaking down these really complex topics and bringing them to a layperson. I think it's also like a middle grade book. For me, as someone who's not like an electrical engineer or something, or an engineer in any physical system, this was very informative for me and was also just beautiful, especially when it comes to like water and we're looking at kind of like green spaces. The comics I just found so gorgeous and I love the details. So I learned a lot as an adult, but it's definitely aimed for like middle grade, kind of introductory. And there's also a section in the back of the book with like the process and different comic layouts that he wrote, as well as like continued learning. So I loved this. I got it from Silver Sprocket in San Francisco, and I'm so glad I own a copy. Because again, it's one that I want like people in my life to read if they're interested. And it's just so beautiful. Like I could totally see myself coming back to this if I want to refresh on like how the internet works. Because, you know, I'm not gonna internalize all this information in the first read, but I definitely learned a lot from it. So yeah, I gave this a solid 4 stars and I had a great time with it. So those were all the books I read in February, but there is one book that I started reading and just gave up on. And I wouldn't say I do that super often. I feel like at this point I know my taste. I know what books I gravitate towards and which ones are kind of bound to be good for me. And this one I picked up as a mystery book from Green Apple Books in San Francisco, mostly because it's set in Rockville, Maryland, which is where I went to high school, kind of with the promise of like a multi-generational Chinese restaurant. It's called the Beijing Duck House in Rockville, and it follows a set of characters as they go through their everyday life and challenges with the restaurant. I just hated it. Like, after I read the first chapter, I was like, these characters are so annoying. It's not funny. The writing is so plain and lackluster. I did give it my 50-page rule. I read 50 pages before giving up on it, because that's what I try to always do, unless it's, you know, horrible. But I just didn't care, and since I put it down, I have not thought about it since, which is too bad, because based on the premise, I should be interested in this, but I really did not like the writing style. It felt like the writing was trying too hard to be funny, but like also was just so annoying. So yeah, this was a book I read like kind of halfway through the month and I just gave up on. Or this month was a diverse set of reading for me. I had a great time and I'm really excited for what to read next. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you read in February or what you're looking forward to reading in March, or if you've read any of these books, what you thought about them. I'll see you soon. Peace.